Well, with no more further ado, we're running a little bit late, so I guess we'll start immediately. As Yulia said, congratulations, you've raised the round. It took months and tons of meetings, and now the hard work begins. You have to take that plan and move it that you presented to all your investors and move it to completion. So, like I said, it's the hard work. So I'd like to introduce our panels. Start at the end. Surbhi, would you like to begin? And then we'll just introduce ourselves down and start talking about our experiences.
Fantastic. Hi, everybody. My name is Surbhi. I'm currently running my second company. My first company was called Envision Medical, and we worked on the early detection of ovarian cancer. It was a medical device company. I founded that company in my mid-20s, took it through several FDA clearances and clinical studies, and then it was acquired by Boston Scientific for $275 million back in 2018. And then I stayed at Boston Scientific for a couple of years, and then joined Y Combinator as their first general partner dedicated to healthcare and life sciences. Did that for about half a decade, and while I was there, the AI moment happened, and I was funding like world-class AI researchers from around the world to build amazing technologies for every industry besides medical devices. And I thought, man, surely that someone that knows the in and outs of medical device development is going to harness the power of AI to bring a product forward specifically for our industry. But it never happened. So after being torn about it for about 6 months, I did the unthinkable and left the dark side, the venture side, to go back and start my second company. I raised a $30 million seed round for that 5 months ago. And that's me.
Hey folks, my name is Tian with Phiex Technologies. We're in the sterilization space, replacing the use of cancer-causing toxin during the manufacturing of medical devices. And previously bootstrapped my prior company and spun this one off with the former head of global R&D from Baxter. It's been a fun journey. It's been a really interesting journey, disrupting a very, very staid industry, very important one. So happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Patrik Schmidle. I'm the founder and CEO of CARI Health. And we're a clinical stage, venture-backed MedTech device company. Prior to this venture, I was fortunate enough to be part of multiple exits, but in other industries. And then my MedTech journey actually started when I had a close family member that struggled with opioids. And that was pretty traumatic for our family, but it did reveal the treatment gap that prevents millions of Americans from escaping this vicious cycle of opioid addiction. And that treatment gap is that methadone patients drop out of treatment at very, very high rates. And so since then, we've been on a mission to develop a device that enables personalized dosing so methadone patients can stay in treatment. So that's me.
Excellent. Jeff Chu, co-founder, managing partners of Features Capital. We're an early-stage MedTech venture fund investing across seed to Series B. We think about the investable market in two ways, one by disease state, so we tend to focus on the 5 largest chronic disease states: cardiovascular disease, oncology, diabetes, neurology, metabolic health, and diabetes. We're technology agnostic. We like to invest in companies at the earliest stage and really help them drive towards first revenue or first in human. Prior to Features, I took the founder's journey, like many of these individuals here and yourselves. I was a federally funded researcher, inventor, technologist, operator, built, scaled, and exited my previous company, really leveraging that experience and helping to streamline the innovation process in MedTech, which is, as you all know, incredibly burdensome. So happy to be here. Thanks to MedTech World. Thanks to all of you for staying and listening to us at the end of the day.
Thank you. And I'm Patrick O'Neill. I am the partner at MedTech Advantage Fund. We are a fund that is focused on exclusively investing in graduates of MedTech Innovator from all cohorts for the last 12 years, as many of you know, being part of this year's cohort or alumni. MedTech Innovator is the largest, and I would argue best MedTech-focused accelerator in the world. And we're focused on those companies because they give us superior returns. Prior to that, I worked for an organization called Connecticut Innovations. They are the venture capital arm for the state of Connecticut. I worked my way up from associate to managing director on several deals, including Avitas Orthopedics, exiting to Zimmer, Smart Equip, which was bought by Ritchie Brothers, and Cool IT, which was taken out by KKR. So with that, like I said, we have a great panel here from both sides of the aisle on the investors as well as entrepreneurs and both sides of the aisle. Yourself, Surbhi. What would you say is the most important thing, Jeff, that entrepreneurs can do in that first 100 days that you see that they typically might miss?
Great question. So when I think about the first 100 days, it's really an opportunity to do a reset, right? You took on institutional capital. If you're a first-time fund, or if you're raising a seed round or pre-seed round, you're taking on some institutional capital. This is probably your first time building a institutionalized board. And so really thinking about what that means, what does governance look like, how to build a board culture, how do you make sure that everyone on the board understands setting expectations, setting some norms about how you communicate, the values around that. For me, when I fundamentally think about these things, the board's such a critical factor in being your partner in this journey. And what we really want to make sure as a board member is to make sure that we're going to be most effective. And the only way we can be most effective is that we're all aligned with both the mission and the values that you want to have and that the company has. And when we get to that point, because we all know what happens when bad stuff happens, you want to be able to rely on the basic elements of values, integrity, communication, transparency, openness. Those are the things I think about because it's not always easy. The other thing I think about too is, you just finished this transaction. If you took on multiple rounds of capital, do you know even what's in your amendments of articles of incorporation and your bylaws? What rights do your investors have at different stages and classes? Take that time to really digest that information and understand what you can't do, what you have in your side letters, just the basic administrative stuff so you could hit the ground running and understand what that looks like. So that's really starting at the top and then working your way down. The other thing I think about too is how to set the same tone for the employees that work for you and your team members. So doing the same sort of exercise of making sure we're all aligned with what this next round of financing does, the use of funds, the milestones, and how, if you're hiring team members, thinking about the same thing about your company culture. So, yeah.
Sounds like we did it all wrong. No, so there's when I think back, we raised our seed round back in 2022, closed it right at the end of the year. And so the latter part of it was getting tougher and tougher and tougher to close it out. But there's three priorities that we identified post-close. And the very first one is to make sure that above all, we have our plan in place and resources in place to execute against our milestone, which was to take our prototype device to a first-in-human study. So that's the first priority. Second priority was, because the goalposts were shifting during the latter part of 2022 in terms of what you're going to need to get to in order to raise a Series A. And so we started reaching out to VCs actually to validate and confirm that if we got to our milestone that yes, indeed, we would be able to raise a Series A. And if not, what do we need to get to? And then the third priority was that we looked at the risks. What were the biggest risks that we were facing, and what contingency plans could we put in place to mitigate those risks? So those are the three priorities. Execute the plan, what do we need for a Series A, and then contingency plans.
So for us, and it'll be interesting because we have one of our current investors on this panel, so we can check from his perspective whether we did a good job or not. But we closed our last round kind of end of the summer, 23. And but to really understand what we were dealing with was to understand the macro environment in our space, right? There was very little innovation in the sterilization space for decades. And then all of a sudden, in quick succession, at the end of the previous year, a huge jury trial returned a guilty verdict for one of the largest players, $363 million in punitive damages for one plaintiff. That company settled for $400 million for one plant that was about 40% of their revenue at the time. And so the entire industry was completely threatened by the prospect of losing their ability to make sterile product and sell it. And so we were completely inundated with inbound business from some of the larger strategics at the time, and our main focus was, close this round, convert the customers, and get them using our product. And we actually ended up learning a lot about what worked, a lot of what didn't work, which was how conservative these companies were, and at the same time, within that first 100 days, we were also dealing with the fact that DoD had found out about what we were doing in the civilian world and had awarded us a contract to turn this into a medical device. So now we were commercializing two things. So that was a time where we had to do a lot of over-communicating with our investors. It's a very nuanced space. Most investors don't invest in supply chain and manufacturing medical device. It's just make the medical device, make sure it works, get it to the doc. And so that's what has been really important for us continuing since that time, to keep people updated about what we see is happening and how we see that we're going to adjust or not to bring something so disruptive to market.
Could I quickly follow up on that? Because
Yes.
obviously I'm the one who invested in this entity. But I'll give you the other side of the perspective, which I think is super helpful and adds a little bit more context for this. So when, as VCs, you're underwriting to a certain plan. And when the plan changes, that's not a good thing, right? That's kind of scary because you had done all this due diligence, you spent all this time, you did all your modeling around this thing, and you expected a certain profile, a time perspective on that, a return profile. And so this goes back to my previous comment about really making sure that you're establishing great communication, openness, setting those values, sharing those values with the founders and the founding team so that you can have open conversations about what the environment looks like. The last thing we want to do is support a plan that doesn't make sense, right? And so we all know at this earliest stage, you're doing a bunch of customer discovery work and you're going to learn along the way. And as you're learning, you're probably going to pivot. So part of that pivot is like making sure you're communicating to the board, to your shareholders, and sharing what you're learning so that they can be helpful along that journey as well. So I think from our perspective, we set up early on. I think one of our first conversations after we closed was, how do we communicate? How do we talk to each other? How often? And how do we share that information? And I think we just established some basic norms, and those evolve over time. So it's been great.
Absolutely.
Amazing. So when let me see. I've about just finished my first 100 days of my second company. And I also, when I was at YC, I funded about 200 companies. So I've seen a lot of first 100 days. So let me reframe this a little bit and talk about a couple of things that we at YC will repeatedly see as things that kill the company. So the first is worrying too much about what investors want and not thinking from first principles. What do I need to convince myself that this company is going to be successful? What are the milestones that are the biggest risk to the success of this company? And then how do I then turn that into value inflection points, which makes sense when I go out to raise? So that's the number one thing. Number two is hiring too quickly. Before you raise money, you're inundated with work, right? And our industry is really hard to raise capital. And now your back is breaking under all of the work that you have to do. So it's really, really tempting to do a couple of things. First, hire the first person you interview. Very tempting. You're you're good enough, oh my gosh, I'm dying, just take all this work. The second thing is to hire even when you cannot imagine the 10 to 12 hours of work a day this person should be doing. So then you cause bloat in your organization. Does that make sense? It's the folks, when you raise money, especially at an early stage, everyone should feel very, very busy. And establishing this culture of working very hard means that everyone around the table needs to be working very hard. And if you like, let's say that you're hiring 4 people or something, you're like a 5-person team, even 1 out of the 5, like clocking out at 5 p.m. makes an impact on everybody else. So, not setting milestones according to what you think needs to be de-risked versus like what you're hearing externally. That should be taken into account, but nobody will ever understand the company like you do. You are the founder. Like, you are the voice of truth. Like, listen to that. What is the thing that keeps you up at night, and run towards that? Does that make sense? Like, do not brush it under the rug. It will come to bite you in the butt. If not that year, like 3 years later. The second thing is hiring too quickly, and the third is like hiring the wrong people, right? Being really intentional about your culture early on and what's important to you and what isn't. Everything from like the type of humor you want to have in the office, the level of skill set you want, how senior the people you want to have around, like these things matter a lot, right? Some people are cool hiring junior folks first and then, finding senior folks as the company progresses. Just remember that hiring is like a long game. So even if you think someone is too senior to be hiring at that moment, in those first 100 days, don't limit yourself. Think, if I could have any person as my head of XYZ, who is that person going to be? And start establishing a relationship with them. So yeah, I'm like in my first 100 days, and so I could like keep going, but maybe I should stop.
Could I add one more thing to this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. The other thing I'll like, that, to Surbhi's point about like making sure you have a plan, executing it, making sure everyone's on the same page. The other thing I think is super helpful is like, you've had a partner doing the due diligence process, running to a transaction, who dived so freaking deep into your company, who sat side by side with you, asked you questions, challenged your plans. That's the best time to start to use them as a sounding board, right? Because they're probably as knowledgeable about all aspects of your business. For us, our due diligence process, I'll probably spend, 120 to 160 hours of person time to dive into a business, to understand what we're looking at and all the risks and how to mitigate those risks. I'm going to quickly lose all of that information in like 3 weeks. So like, that's the time to engage them and have like meaningful conversations, because otherwise I don't have the capacity to continue to retain that information that you will as a founder.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I do think at the same time, it's like this careful balance, because when you were a CEO out fundraising is so hard and time consuming that you may or may not have been paying enough attention to your team and communicating in that way. And so then the person you set the plan with, in my opinion, is not the board. Sorry, hot take. I don't know if that's a hot take. Hopefully you guys agree. The people that you come up with the initial plan with are your executives and other people around the table, and then you present it to the board, and you get their approval and buy-in, and you get their like yes or no, or I would do this better. But like the actual formulation, in my mind, and I sit on public company boards, I sit on privately held boards, I do a lot of the board, too many boards. I just find like the most productive conversations happen when the CEO has a really well vetted plan that they're then bringing to the investors. My opinion. Because otherwise it's very time consuming to go external and internal.
I think I would take the opposite position on that, or at least on a nuance, in that in a small company, seed stage, your board really should be your semi-external advisors. And it goes to part of the first 100 days is the pre-100 days of finding the right investors who understand where you are and the stage, not only the stage of the company, but the level of experience that you are as a CEO, and how much trust, how much advice and work they're going to need. I've had the privilege of working with extremely experienced CEOs and first-timers. One of the first deals I did, the CEO came back to me after the close, called him and congratulated him, and then 2 days later he goes, by the way, for this board meeting, what should be in a board deck? And do you have a handbook or something I could read? It was like, okay, we're starting from scratch here. And he took on that communication very well, that he would call me weekly, and I was basically the third employee of the company. So from them, I would want, especially with the pivot, the last thing you want to do in a board meeting is a surprise. Those are just deadly. But as the pivot is starting and the team starts thinking they need to, I think it makes sense not only for the investor board seats, but for the independents, that they are engaged in this, because if you're doing a major pivot and your independents aren't weighing in on it, why have them on the board, right? Or why would you not, why waste the equity on them if they can't help you with that pivot, right? I mean, I think it's a nuance between the two positions, but I just think, especially in the early stage companies, that take advantage of that board.
Totally. I think there's a difference between how deep you go in when, right? So like a tactical operating plan, like, hey, we all decide that in this round of funding, we need to get to FDA approval, right? And there's some board members who are like, I need to be involved in the strategy of like whether it's a 510K or a de novo, and like what exactly indication for use are you going to do to, in that case, I would prefer to hear from my CEOs a plan for me to react to. Now, a pivot, what I've learned seeing all these companies pivot is usually if the company is pivoting, it's a good idea that they're pivoting, right? Like no founder CEO loves to pivot for no reason. But that is a place where your investors, when they invested, they basically bought into you and a plan and a space. Let's say like those three things. So if it's changing, you want to engage them as early as is reasonable. I don't think I would engage them personally at the moment, the very moment that I realize I need to pivot. For me, it would be like 3 days later, where I'm like, hey, I want to pivot. This is what I want to pivot to, and this is why. This is what it means to our go-to-market strategy. This is what it means for reimbursement. It's like a level of detail, you know? And then like you said, there is a very big difference between like first-time founders and someone that's like been there and gone through the cycles a little bit.
I think I agree with what you're saying as far as you want it, on the other side of that, of what I said previously, you don't want to show up with, I have no answers. It's, here's what we're thinking, here's the plan, and then you let them poke and get some feedback. Patrik, you went through a pivot recently. Maybe some feedback there.
Yes, you're right. No CEO wants to pivot unless they have to. But the way that we navigated our pivot, and it took place over probably the course of 6 months of realizing that we had to pivot and exploring what our options are, and then ultimately deciding what we're going to pivot to. And it was really, really important to make the board a part of the process of that pivot. So they understood fully why we're pivoting. They understood what the options were, and then they understood and bought into what we're pivoting to. And so ultimately, we were fortunate that our pivot has worked out so far. But it's not for the faint of heart, and for us, it was a significant pivot because it was basically a technology pivot. So it takes a lot of communication and alignment and listening, because it's really difficult to get everybody on the same board, on the same page. No pun intended. Board's on the board. Board's on there. You got to get the board on board.
You know, I wouldn't say we pivoted so much as realized when we were working with all these customers, you know, they were eager to do work with us. They were eager to pay us to do work to validate for sterilization. And then we realized, oh, wait, the typical way something is bought in this category is completely, is not sufficient for how we need to be deployed within an organization. As in, typically, just for background, if someone were to, you know, need to sterilize something, you call someone, they have a plant, you send it to the plant, they send it back to you. Whereas what we were doing is we were bringing that capability in-house, but without a machine. So there was a lot of things that needed to change. And something that I realized shortly thereafter closing the round was, actually, rather than this industry having a bunch of, early adopters, innovative, customers, the majority of a MedTech company, especially the enterprise accounts, behave like the majority adopters and the laggards. They wanted to see a whole ecosystem of solutions. And so it was actually great timing when we got the contract award opportunity with the DoD. They saw what we were doing and said, we need a battle space application. Here's a rough amount of units we'd estimate. It was a perfect fit because we had a system that matched their needs, but it could underwrite the development of this whole ecosystem from a customer perspective. And so we actually pulled back from engaging with all these accounts because we realized, you know what, we need to take away all the reasons the organization has to say no. So a lot of my efforts were focused on not how do I have enough people on the team? To your point, we're very slow to hire. How do I know this is actually a signal of product market fit, or it's just an early signal of the market reacting to something? And so in a space where there's no playbook, right, you have to develop the playbook, and I was testing a lot of my hypotheses about why companies were reacting the way they were, what was stopping them, or what caused someone to move faster than others. And after that, I felt like was quite well vetted, was when I started to communicate with our investors. And that happened over the course of, a couple months. But again, when there's no tactical playbook for something you're doing, you have to go out and develop it and have a lot of confidence when you're telling your investors who invested in your ability to execute and generate enterprise value, that you're gonna, if you come up against a roadblock, that you're gonna figure out a way around it.
So clearly communication is the underlying theme here across. Surbhi, I'd be interested in your thoughts, actually in everyone's thoughts on this particular. Is the best time, I think, to fill out the independents on the board, advisory panels, et cetera, is as soon as possible after that first close. And mainly because when you really need them, when things maybe aren't going well and you're running low on cash, it's much more difficult in my mind to get quality people involved in the company. And I want to get your thoughts on that and maybe some converse opinions on it and see about the best time to bring on those panels and independents.
I like that you're calling out in advance that there's going to be converse opinions on this. Yeah, and
Be boring if there wasn't.
Yeah, like a founder's founder here. So I think you should have no one on your board during seed stage. So that's my preference. If you can pull that off, awesome. If you do take a board member, I raised $30 million out the gate, so this. I have a board member. Hopefully it's someone that you either know really, really well or enjoyed working with in the process. Now, the question was specifically around an independent director and how to think about that and timing for that, right? And again, the independent director having a lot of operational experience, I think so let's say you raise around a funding, and now you have two people from the venture side of things and you on the board, to really balance out the opinions on the room, having a very experienced operator who has been there and done that and seen similar paths as you, and who you already sort of have some sort of relationship with, and know to some extent, can be really helpful. The way there's a gentleman named Andrew Cleland who was my independent board director for my first company. And, Andrew was this seasoned founder, had sold a couple of companies already, really well known in the industry. And what I did before pulling him on the board is get to know him for a period of 6 months. So I do think sometimes there's this tension where the investors do want to place someone on the board that they know really well immediately. There's many advantages for them to do this. And that's fine if the intro comes from them, but I would really take the time to get to know them, because you will have the benefit of those expertise the 6 months that you're getting to know them anyway, right? You should be able to call them and ask them questions. And I would say Andrew was like an integral part of my success at Envision, you know? But I didn't bring him on until Series B. I had no independent until I raised a $12 million round.
Well, I don't know if you want to say anything, but I do think even though it might be easier if you don't have anybody on your board in terms of being able to execute whatever you decide to do, I think it's really important to have a board. At least for us, it was, and we actually we formed our board at the beginning of our raise, and it consisted of an independent board member, and she was a mentor. Through through an accelerator program that we went through, and so I trusted her, and she knew our company and she knew our vision, and so she was the first board member that we brought on, and then the second one was an investor, a large investor, but an individual investor, and so the three of us formed the board before we even started the raise, and so as we raised and funds invested in us, they looked at our board and nobody even requested a board seat. So basically they said, oh, you have a strong board, we're good, we want observer rights. And that worked out really well, and they were all extremely helpful as we were going through the pivot, and I can't imagine having gone through that pivot without their guidance and the collaboration and the thoughts that they provided to help us execute that successfully. So for us, it was critical to have a good board.
I'm a strong believer in having a high-functioning board. I think a high-functioning board can be incredibly accretive to your business and can help accelerate you. And to that end, when we think about board construction, I'm really thinking about, and if you're fortunate enough to have the opportunity to choose your investors, I always think about choosing your investors who are going to be great partners for you, who can work along with you, who share your values, who share the vision, because at the end of the day, you're going to be on a journey with these people for a long time. So you better like the people you work with. And to me, that's, again, if you're fortunate enough to have that opportunity, that's what I've sort of put as a high stake. I also am a strong believer in having a true independent. So although we have the ability to put people up for boards, I really value the voice of someone who has no strings attached, who has truly is going to be a partner for the board. And so when we think about, for my recent company, I just led a deal on, myself and the CEO, we talked a long time, because we're in this due diligence. We're getting to know each other. We want to make sure we could work together. We talked at that point, what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities? What are the gaps at the board level that we need to fill? And how do we find the right individual that's going to make that, to really help accelerate the growth of the business? Because that's the shared vision and goal that we all have. And so we actually put lists together of knowledge, skills, and abilities, put short lists of names together, and then as soon as we closed, we start reaching out to those individuals, and we're having conversations. And so within 100 days, within a quarter, we're teeing that up, and we're ready to go. So, and having that person at the front end of the business as you're starting to build the foundations for the next, and driving towards that next round, driving towards those milestones, that's where you're going to be most critical. They're going to help you see around the corners, or maybe cut some corners, which would be great.
So we still don't have an investor on the board, and it was only towards the end of last year that we brought in an independent. And our thinking, kind of two things. One is structurally how we raised. It wasn't a price round, so we felt it was very important that an investor be brought on when they can be voting on behalf of that particular share class, right, or consider that specific class. But separately, when we were thinking about our independent, we looked at what the biggest gap in the business was. And the biggest gap in the business wasn't necessarily operational specific, because again, there was really no playbook for, we straddle packaging, sterilization. There's no playbook necessarily for the whole business, right? We weren't looking at another company that had, come 5 years or 2 years before us and exited for hundreds of millions of dollars. So we were crafting that ourselves. The area where we were really looking to well understand is how do we maximize the value of engaging with strategics that were coming to us at the time, wanting to partner, wanting to do some deals. We were potentially threatening their market share at the same time. And so we ended up finding someone who we had also followed for a very long time. He had a very long relationship with one of our co-founders, and also shared the values of the company. I prefer to watch people and get to know them, but also watch how they react. There's a little also nuance of how will someone work with me, right? Can they, if you're a female founder, right, it's not the case that everyone could necessarily take strong feedback if we disagree well. What I've experienced as a female founder that looks a certain way, right? And so those were all considerations that I had in mind, but this person has been fantastic because he has literally sold companies to almost all the strategics in the space, right? Knows all the CEOs in the space. And so there was a lot of feedback we got from people who are advisors or informal advisors about, we think this person would be great, or you should bring this person. And if you're building something that's really exciting, you're gonna have people come up to you and say, oh, I'd love to be on your board, right? I'd love to give you ideas and feedback. And that's not really what the job is, right? So pick very carefully, because once they're on there, they have a high influence on the company.
I agree with that entirely. I love that the two of you brought in independence that you knew before bringing on investor board members. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. But both the operational, but also just when you're choosing an independent, having that operational, where's the gap in the business? I think that's a great way to do it. But I think at least equally important is what you said, CL, which is can I call this person in a crisis? And so Andrew, I was working on a women's health company, early detection of ovarian cancer. Andrew did 12, just completely different space. There was no relationship, but he really understood medical devices. He really understood how to get a company acquired, and him and I get along fabulously well. And that is, I actually think, a bit more important than someone that's a perfect, checklist fit. Both things are important, but if I had to choose one, because that is a long-lasting relationship. Your board, this company, I really hope to take public and not sell. So I think of it as who do I want to have this relationship with for 10 to 15 years? It's a very big, so 6 months of dating is nothing when you think of it like that, right?
I think there's a lot of common ground there. Is when you're picking your board members, you need, especially your independents, it has to be not just a big name, but someone that is going to be, you're going to call and they're going to pick up. Not you're going to get their assistant and say, oh, they can talk to you a week from Thursday for 20 minutes. You need someone who you can talk to at 6 o'clock at night on a Friday night and be there for you and give you the good advice. So I 100% agree with you there.
Someone who sees the role as almost sacred, right? Now in this phase of my career, I'm an independent board member to a diagnostic company, a medical device company, a few different companies. And it's if they call me and it's 10 p.m. on a Saturday, I will pick up, right? If my own investors call me, I might wait till the next morning. But if they call, then I'm on the phone, So someone that takes you and your company that seriously and sees things in you before you can see it in yourself. That's a beautiful thing about an independent board member relationship if you can get there.
100% agree. Looks like that is time. I don't know, do we have any time for questions, or we have time for one question? One brave soul.
Hi, sorry, this is actually not a question, so I'll apologize. I'm Deblina, I'm part of the APAC program. Just had to say this because I'm having a big fangirl moment. Surbhi, I was reading your book on my way from Singapore to here, and your story really resonates with me. So thank you for sharing it so powerfully. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, I really appreciate it. It does mean a lot to me. I put my heart into that book, so.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody.
Do we have
Thank
time?
You
Do we have time for one
I didn't see.
question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Nola Masterson with Portfolio. Since you've talked so much about board members and bringing them on early, what do you usually reward them with? What is the normal amount of stock? I know it's not about a cash thing.
That's a good question.
For an independent?
For an independent, yes.
depends on how much time they want to spend with you, 1 to 2%.
Half to one is what I normally start with, but again, it really depends on the amount of engagement and how much they're going to participate in the company and helping you out. And so if you really are a partner in this and side by side and having weekly conversations, it's probably going to require a little bit more.
Yeah, we gave them 1%.
Yeah, we incentivize him on a vesting schedule of 1, and at our stage, it just isn't typically expected that they would be paid at that point.
Yeah, no cash compensation.
All right. Well, thank you very much. A hand for our panel. Great insight. And a picture of all of us.
Thank you so much. Right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask you not to leave the room because we just opened up a Q&A session in the previous one, and this one panel is actually, we're closing up with something very, very different. So we had today presentations with slides, we have today panel discussions, fireside chats, and I felt like you have lots of questions and you all want to interact. So we have our closing session tonight, and it's called AMA, Ask Me Anything Live on Stage. I have a lineup of 5 very brave people who have no script, who have no idea what you're going to ask them, but they're ready to be candid and transparent and hopefully give you the clarity to the answers you have. So please help me to welcome on the stage the panelists. Nate Harrington, Managing Partner at Phillips Ventures. Eric Haynes, Founding and Managing Partner at Haynes Ventures. Vikram Chaudhary, Partner at Genoa Ventures. And Brandon Rosenhan, Founding Partner at Med Mountain Ventures. And the panel will be moderated and curated by Paul Grant, the CEO of MedTech Innovator. Thank you.
All right. Let's see, am I on? Okay, hey everybody. So I believe this is the last session of the day before drinks. So this is a good time for everybody to get those final questions in. I'm Paul Grand, MedTech Innovator CEO. This panel is intended to be an investor Ask Me Anything. The intent of this session is that you basically get to ask all those questions you've been waiting to ask VCs, whether it's something you just thought of today and you're like, oh, I just had this conversation and what do they really mean by that? Whether it's something about the way these particular firms think or behave, anything you want to ask is basically up for grabs. They don't have to answer the question, but of course that's the opportunity here is for you to ask the tough questions or the burning questions. I'm going to give each of our panelists a chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll start with the questions. So I'll go right over here next to me and start with Eric. So you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Paul. So my name's Eric Hines. I'm founder and managing partner of Hines Ventures. Hines Ventures is a pre-seed and seed stage MedTech-focused venture fund. We're currently deploying capital out of our Fund 1, so I'm an emerging fund manager. We have 2 companies in the portfolio so far. We are based in Memphis, Tennessee, so go Tennessee, and largely focused on companies in the U.S. heartland. My personal background is that I've been in the industry for 24 years. So I started out as an engineer with Medtronic, then got experience in marketing and product management with Intuitive Surgical, and most recently was in roles leading corporate development and M&A. So very excited to be on the panel. Thank you.
Terrific. Nate.
Yeah, Nate Harrington, managing partner at Phillips Ventures. I've been with Philips for 14 years. Before that was a decade with Boston Scientific. Before that, management consulting. And roles have primarily centered around business development, so more on buying, acquisition of companies, but also line management responsibility when I had a real job and it wasn't just overhead. And recently joined the venture team, 4 years ago at Philips.
Vikram.
Hi, I'm Vikram Chaudhary, partner at Genoa Ventures and also founder of an early stage company creation firm called General Inception. So kind of sit on both sides of the aisle, both on the company formation side, which is kind of the pre-seed, and then going into the seed Series A, Series B with Genoa. Background's a PhD, did a startup, worked at McKinsey for a number of years, and led a life sciences group for a corporate before joining Genoa Ventures and then starting General Inception at the same time.
Brandon?
I'm Brandon Rosenhan. I'm a critical care physician turned entrepreneur turned VC. We do pre-seed seed. We're a Salt Lake City and Bay Area based firm. We're in about 15 portfolio companies and we write first checks up, sort of about $500,000, $600,000. We do a lot of syndication. So happy to be here.
Fantastic. All right, I'm just going to start right out and see if anybody in the audience has questions they want to start with, and I can always join in. Yeah, so we'll bring a microphone over to you. Just hold on for a moment. All right, go ahead.
I'm Vaidehi Shah from Ultraseal Life Sciences. The question I have for all of you is, where's the appetite for investment today, and what does that mean for valuations? So, any guidance you can give in terms of maybe the range of percentages that you're seeing in terms of ownership taken for rounds being done, and also sort of expected exit payoff ROIs, right? So we can think about, as we think about our institutional rounds, we can think about, okay, what are we going to be giving up, and what type of returns you're going to want to see?
Who wants to go first? Anyone?
I'm happy to.
Yeah,
go
ahead.
This is going to be the least satisfying answer because it all depends on what round, what stage you are, and everything else. So outside of context, it's hard to give like a generalist answer, but let me give it a shot. When you're doing life sciences investing, the underwriting that you're always doing for is something that is going to look like a fund returner for you. So if it's a larger fund, $100 million fund, that's our fund 3, you're sort of looking to get $100 million back for the total investment that you place in a company. So let's say I invested over multiple rounds, 10 million into your company. I would expect that I would be able to underwrite to 100 million back with regards to this. It gives you an order of magnitude. And so you can back calculate from that what the ownership numbers look like. If you're a later stage investor, you're really looking at multiples on the actual capital. You probably don't need that high of a multiple per investment because it's less risk. Early stage investors, we sort of flip that around and we basically say, okay, I need to own X% of the company. I think it's pretty typical for folks to enter into a Series B round if you've been a seed A investor. And you have a large enough fund that you want to be in like sort of double-digit ownership going into that, so 10, 12%, which might mean that if you're doing a seed round, you may actually end up buying something like 20% of the company at that early stage. And your check size is probably going to be somewhere in the $2 to $4 million range, so you can kind of back calculate what that looks like from a valuation standpoint.
And Vikram said it exactly in a much more articulate way that I sort of think about it very early. Same thing. I love that he said exactly, sort of they want to be at like 20% in the first round and then 10% if they're later. And we just do the math since we're pre-seed and if it's seed as well. I just tell people what we're putting in the capital now. We think about what the total outcome is 10 times the fund or, entire fund return, but take whatever we're putting in, multiply it, and then sort of it's going to be half after dilution. So there's a lot of different ways to get that math, but essentially he just did the same math for you, which is they want 20% and then fully diluted as the company grows, they want 10. So I sort of always think that divide in half for us investors. And we can help you do that. So a lot of our early stage folks, we say, look, help you understand why we're thinking about this and why we need to return the fund for us. Because we have investors just like you do. So it's sort of, that's an ongoing conversation, and I'm sure most of your VCs would have you just walk through that.
that answer the question? Any other follow-up on that? Are you good? Okay. Next question. Anyone have a follow-up question over there on the side? Let's wait for the mic to come over to you.
Yeah.
Hi, Evelina Popova with Kelvin Health. In one of the earlier panels, we talked about the impact of HEOR and observational data or observational research as we are looking into funding. Would you say whether qualitative or quantitative data from clinician users has more impact? Would you like to see one more than the other? Or is there a situation where one is more impactful than the other? So one is qualitative, where we go out and interview users, payers, you name it, and the other one is we look at the data point generated either from the device or from any sort of putting it out there in the world, having someone use it, and then measuring fidelity or usage of these devices with real users.
All right, anybody need a clarification or anything? Or you guys, anyone have an answer you want to start with? Eric?
Yeah, so because I invest at the pre-seed level, a lot of this work is still under development. So one of the things that we do at our fund actually is that we've brought on venture partners that specialize in areas like healthcare economics and reimbursement and market access. And so by having those folks on our team, they are able to help us out in diligence to understand what the status is of your pathways when it comes to healthcare economic data, and then what are we looking to do as far as implementing a plan after the investment's been made to help be able to fill those gaps.
Looking at it from a strategic standpoint, I think, first of all, we probably don't go as early as you may be suggesting. We tend to have our own opinion on the market in terms of, say, access, where the market's going, feedback from our customers, because we're dealing with them directly. And when it comes to clinical data, the more quality clinical or preclinical data you have to make things clearer, the better.
Maybe like Nate on just a quick follow-up to that, which is, as you think about your data sets that matter the most for you from an investment standpoint, does it actually hold more water if it's a user of like a Philips tool or a KOL that is on your advisory board that is actually a user of a particular product and can give you immediate validation, or the KOL? So the quality of the actual clinician also matters. It's not just the data from the clinicians, or how much weight do you put on those things?
Sure. So, I mean, when I'm talking clinical data, I'm talking what's been performed in cases, say, for like a PMA type of product. But I think you're right when you talk about feedback, because we talk with our KOLs. I would say it's twofold. You want to speak with your KOLs because you know them, they know you, and there's a degree of trust. And then I think there's the simple fact of, well, talking with the real thought leaders who are preeminent in the space. And it really shouldn't matter what their relationship is to Philips. And I would say more when I'm thinking of it, either in the past from an M&A perspective or now investor, I actually really don't care what the relationship with Philips is. I want the right person who's able to speak credibly on the topic.
Good question, Vikram. And by the way, panelists, you guys are welcome to ask each other questions as well if we have a dearth of questions from the audience. All right, I see a bunch of hands going up. Okay.
I'll give a softball. I know, Paul, you said this was for the tough questions, but for each of you, what is the hardest part of your job as an investor? And as founders, what can we do to help make your jobs easier besides exit our companies after you invest?
You want to go, Eric?
Well, as a first-time fund manager, especially in this economy, the hardest part of my job, the hardest thing I've ever actually done professionally is raise money from LPs for a first-time fund in MedTech. So that's the answer. Now, how founders can help me with that is being able to network, just like we do here at conferences like this, introduce each other to people who may be interested in our thesis, and find opportunities to be able to connect each other.
Depends upon the week. But something which I think is in general a challenge that, as I'll say more as an investor, that you have to step in is probably fundraising. It really comes down to, it takes a lot, and we have changed CEOs because of the ability to fundraise or not. It's one of those intangibles. I think the rest of it you kind of know a little bit better. I don't know if that's a great answer, but I would say fundraising is something where we often find ourselves rolling up our sleeves.
Yeah, I won't repeat the previous comments because I think those are both like sort of top of mind. But one other version of this is leadership change. So sometimes when you go in early, you're invested in a team. We're like anybody else, right? Like you get emotionally attached to the team that you're working with because you're in the trenches, you're doing the work with them on a day-to-day basis, and a lot of times you end up meeting their families, you develop a strong relationship with them. But you have to make the change at some point in time because of stage, because of lack of performance, because of a number of different factors that might weigh in on that front. And so that, I think, that human element of like making the leadership change sometimes is the hardest, particularly for early stage investors. And I think the easiest way or the best thing that founders or entrepreneurs can do is just understand that it's not personal. It's in the best interest of the organization and the success of the company, and that's what's needed. I've been fortunate that the last couple of changes that we've had to make, the founders themselves have been like very involved in that process and have supported that process all the way through, and so they've had like a level of maturity that makes life a lot easier. When you have to do it hard, it's just unplanned and changes or places where you're removing the CEO and you're losing all of that knowledge out of the gate is probably going to destroy value in the company, and that's always true.
Yeah, great question. I think I'll actually dovetail real quickly on something Vikram said is, if you're a successful, very early entrepreneur and you want to be successful and you think that you want your company to grow, unless you're, I'd say, in the top sort of 20/80, the top 20% of people that take things all the way to the end or less, you ought to already start with that thought. As a matter of fact, Vikram and I are invested in the same company, and we were very early, and we said to the CEO very beginning, he was very humble, and we said, look, at some stage, you will be the CTO, and you just have to kind of know that now, because I've been there in my own company, and as an entrepreneur earlier, I had to know who would take over at the next stage. So I think that is hard to have that conversation. But that particular founder did a phenomenal job, and the company continues to progress. And then for me personally, one of the hard things, so that's how you help us as venture, so I just double down on what Vikram said. And the way that's hard for me as a venture capitalist is I was a founder, and I actually created our fund so that I could invest in talented PhD, technology-driven health individuals and physicians. And then the irony is now that we see so many deals because there's so many talented entrepreneurs with great technology that we can only pick a very small amount. So that's actually hard for me. It's kind of like a bleeding heart answer, but like I wanted to help people because it was so hard for me to raise capital in my early first stage company. I had like 70 people on the cap table. But now what I hoped I'd do as a VC is also really hard because we just can't do it as much, right? We've made 15 investments, and I would say very conservatively, like in terms of just getting an email and with a deck or just having someone do an elevator pitch, forget about that, just the deck and then going diligence. We've looked at like thousands and thousands of deals to do 15 investments in our last fund, and this fund will be similar, except we'll see more, and then we'll do like 20 investments.
I just want to triple down on what Vikram said. I look back and I think of how in the past year I've had 4 CEO changes, and fortunately, they went well. It doesn't always go that way, but it's probably one of the more challenging things. And usually, there are exceptions, as you point out, but usually you don't have lifers.
Okay, great answers. Next question over there on Is that Guru over there? Yeah. Mike's coming to you. Oh, sorry, in the front. Go ahead.
Hi. One of the MTI accelerator companies, and I'm not quite sure if it's relevant to everybody, but I wanted to ask is who's investing in diagnostics? And if not, is diagnostics dead? I suppose we've been hearing from investors and people who do it for last 3 days, and the question is emerging, is it a failure from strategics that in the last 5-10 years they haven't acquired companies? And the relevant context I'll give in that, for example, hardware plus infectious diseases, AMR. Everybody recognizes it's a great challenge. It needs to be solved. So should founders be picking companies and choosing not based on unmet need, but where the sector is investing? I mean, any thoughts? And please be candid, because we have founded the companies we need to raise, and it's probably in that case not the fault of founder or founding team if the sector itself is not pushing money in it.
I'll jump real quick and say we do diagnostics, but sort of as a physician, you always say diagnosis drives therapy. Unless we can connect the dots very clearly with the success, we do not do diagnostics just to do diagnostics, right? I mean, sort of like you can monitor this and you can have that at home and you can sort of know everything. We have to see the thesis between having a diagnostic that will be connecting to a therapy, a solution that will actually treat patients in a way that is, number one, reimbursed, and number two, has a good outcome for healthcare in general, and that will be either subsidized by the government or supported by private industry.
I think we also invest in diagnostics. And just to kind of build on what Brandon said, I'd go, you got to think about where you're going to exit. So worry less about where are the dollars flowing, because dollars flow based off of a number of different reasons, right? If I see yet another liquid biopsy company, I mean, I don't know if that's going to cut it, right, for us. But you have to think about the exit in mind, which obviously immediately means that do you have strategic relationships, connectivity? Can you actually connect the dots to like where an exit or where the home is going to be and where it's going to land? Because it's a really expensive journey to do diagnostics, depending on where you're headed. On top of that, you're not going to see money for a while. People tend to think like, oh, well, there's these like Exact Sciences is worth like $13 billion, so isn't that a comp for me? Well, Exact Sciences IPO'd for $220 million. They became billions of dollars after they got reimbursement and coverage, and their reimbursement stopped getting rejected, and all of that stuff happens. And so you have to keep that in mind and be sober about the fact that like the exits actually eerily look a lot more like they're capped in terms of like the early exits that are going to really happen. And so having strategic relationships and collaborations early on is sort of your best bet in terms of being able to do that. And honestly, look for foundations and non-dilutive financing to sort of help you out in that capital journey, because that's your best way. So like looking for those sorts of partnerships is the best bet in order to be able to attract additional capital onto that platform. So
we don't do diagnostics.
I don't do diagnostics either.
Okay, half the panel does. All right, Guru.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Guru Raj. I come from Singapore. At Tech, we are developing and manufacturing bioresorbable orthopedic implants. So my question to the panel is that when a non-US startup reaches out to you, in your experience, what are the usual communication or cultural pitfalls which you experience in terms of their understanding of the US markets? And what would your advice be, like how can a non-US startup resonate better with the US VC?
And will you invest in a non-US startup as well?
So I could take that. So our fund is limited to US-based entities only. So that's number one. Number two is you have to think about the bandwidth that your managers have at these venture funds. And we've got a lot of inbound coming in. And so if we're going to take time to review something, it's got to fit within our fund mandate, which would be US only. Now, working with partners like MedTech Innovator to be able to help support the ecosystem, I feel strongly about volunteering and helping out where I can, but it's just from a kind of bandwidth perspective, I have to be limited in what I can respond and engage with.
Sure.
We'll invest globally, and I think that's because we, to some degree, will acquire globally. Now, that said, we tend to predominantly invest in, aside from North America, Europe, Israel. I think you can't underestimate necessarily the cultural differences and just the familiarity with, I'll call it the U.S. marketplace. It happens to be the largest homogeneous market, so it's something that I think most strategics are very mindful of. And I think when you're looking at investing in someone, say we have an investment in a Korean company, they're very smart, capable people, but they are lacking a bit in their understanding of how to approach the U.S. market. And this is where things can get tricky. We're an investor. I am not partnering with them. If they want to partner with the business, then they deal with the business. So we try to separate church and state a little bit. I don't know if I'm answering your question well or not, but there's no monopoly in where good ideas come from. So I think, at least as a multinational, you're mindful of everything.
Other guys,
we don't invest out of the U.S. But you should know the answer, Paul. I'm going to turn it back on you if you need to add anything to what he said.
Well, I can certainly add my thoughts, but I was just going to ask on the, will you invest in non-U.S. entities at all?
We do. Like
Yeah.
we've had a couple of investments outside the U.S., so like I don't think that that's necessarily there. The important thing is going to be, this is maybe overly nuanced, but on the legal side, you want to make sure it's incorporated in the right geography. So almost every single entity in the U.S., and this is in fact true for all of our U.S. entities, if it's a U.S. entity and it's not incorporated in Delaware, we will ask you to incorporate it in Delaware, or we can't invest with regards to that. So that's just a requirement. I'm happy to talk to you about that. I don't want to bore the audience with like why that is. Similarly, in Europe, you have to make sure that you understand which entity it is and like are you in the tax advantaged geography for you to be able to do this. And this is all related to being able to have what's called QSBS for our investors. And that if you can't do that and you can't operate under the right geography with all of the right IP and litigation and the corporate legal precedents that have been set already, it becomes really difficult for us to get over the corporate diligence piece of it. That's kind of the gating item. Beyond that, it's just about the idea and the entrepreneur.
By the way, I know we only have like 1 minute left, but I've got a question back over there. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, just one quick question. I'm curious about how you, beyond capital, how do you work with your investees or portfolio companies to actually realize value or within the value creation process?
So one of the things I like most about being a pre-seed investor is that I get to bring my network to the table, so not just the capital. And that's incredibly valuable at the stage that you're at because there's so many things that come about in business where just finding the right people to help guide you in those decisions is key. So that's one way in which I help partners or founders I invest in. Other one may be co-marketing opportunities. So I actually did a LinkedIn Live session with one of our portfolio companies a week or two ago, which was a great way to be able to help get their word out, share their story, and also to be able to demonstrate a little bit about the relationship between me and that founder, which is important for me as I'm starting to build my brand as a fund manager. Thank you.
So this will be a shameless plug for strategics. I think with the right strategic and the right individual on the board, they can bring a lot of value. They bring a lot of insights in terms of the market. We can also give access to some of our experts when it comes to sounding from a regulatory, clinical aspect. I know we try to be very careful not to make it directed as this is what Philips wants you to do. that's not a good idea. And I think that's also the important thing in general, if you think it's right to have a strategic on your board, is to, and this may sound ironic coming from a strategic, but not to get too entangled. We tend to go for pretty vanilla investments, not trying to limit it, but I think the value of having a strategic there is we're not a potted plant. We should be able to bring some insights. Sometimes we can even share material. I know we've given access to imaging equipment when we've needed that. So, and I think the other thing about us having a strategic on the cap table is depending who it is, you've already signaled to other investors that there's one potential exit opportunity. So it's a way of validation on it. So I think that can help bring rounds together. I think you just need to be really careful with how you negotiate and what rights you do not offer a strategic.
Excellent. Anybody else want to weigh in on the answer to that? How you add value? Anything else? Pretty good in terms of capturing the thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think early stage investing, like I think you need pretty much everything. So having investors, and I'm sure Brandon, like for you guys, is, you know, bringing the right expertise to the table of having seen that journey before 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 times, knowing exactly what to expect and helping entrepreneurs see around the corner is probably the biggest value add that an investor can bring on their own. And then outside of that, what we try to do is make sure that the little things around the back office and other things are like efficiently managed. And so if they can't manage it or can't hire the right person in the right geography, we try to bring that resource externally through some of our collaborative partners. And then, of course, we do the marketing and PR piece as well.
And I would just add that if you think about having like a whole bunch of different investors, we all have different Rolodexes or contact lists. And so if you're looking for expertise on your management team from prior portfolios, it's very helpful from just a network aspect in bringing in talent. And then I think just in general, whether it's expertise around market access, reimbursement, we've seen a lot of different companies use different advisors. So it's a way of just having a series of consultants already on there. And the more experienced ones you get, the more savvy ones you get, the more they can bring to the table. And I know this has been said before, but I can't overemphasize how important having the right investors around the table is, or maybe otherwise stated, how important it is not to have unhelpful investors at the table or on your board.
There's a new book, or not relatively new, called Founder versus Investor, so go read that one.
Good, excellent. All right, I know we're way over time. Are we okay? Should we wrapping up? All right, this is the last session. Thank you, panel, for asking anything that was asked. Good job, much appreciated. And you guys will be in the reception afterwards if they want to talk to you? Okay, good, awesome. All right, great, we're gonna do a panel photo.